You ever just kind of feel like sometimes in life you just trying to climb out of a pit? Sometimes in life we end up in a pit and it's of no fault of our own. It's just life circumstances happen, death, job situations, careers, relationships fall apart. Um, and we wake up and we say, like, how did I get here? How did I end up in this pit? And sometimes it can feel like you're just stuck. You're just stuck in the hole and you're like, man, how am I going to get out of this? What I love about the Bible is that it gives us examples of people who ended up just like that. Matter of fact, there's a psalmist, David, who wrote in Psalms 40, says, I waited patiently for the Lord and he heard my cry. He brought me up out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay. And he set my feet on a rock and he established my goings. And he put a new song in my mouth, even a praise unto my God. Many shall see it and fear and shall trust in the Lord. It made me begin to wonder, I wonder which situation he was talking about. David, like us, found himself in several pits in his life. Just like us. Some that are no fault of his own. And others, if he was to look in the mirror, he was holding the shovel. You ever been there? I know I have. Some of the worst pits I've ever been in are the ones that I dug myself. And so, what's cool about this psalm is that whether we dug the pit ourselves or it was of no fault of our own, there's a God who loves us so much that he reaches down in to the muck and the mire and he pulls us out. And he sets our feet upon a rock. And he establishes our goings. He even puts a new song in our mouth. Even a praise unto our God. And many shall see it. They'll witness what God's doing in our life. And they too will find hope in the Lord because of your experience. Because of my experience. I've been through a lot of tragedy in my life. Just like maybe you have. Or if you haven't experienced much yet, there's a good chance you might. None of us know why our lives go the way they do. And, one time I asked, why me, Lord? And he said, hey, why not you? You see, the Bible's filled with characters who inspire us by their stories of overcoming adversity and trials and tragedy. And God lays out their life before us in a very transparent way. And sometimes we see their strengths and we see their weaknesses. And yet he uses their story to help us get out of our pit. David's such a good example. The Word of God says that David was a man after God's own heart. After all his mistakes. But David loved the Lord. And David had a habit of looking at life through a set of glasses called faith. Faith is having full assurance, confidence, and trust in God. And in spite of his circumstances, at the end of the day, it was David's heart. He trusted in the Lord. And he had full assurance and he had confidence that God would see him through it. Think about just the fact that when the prophecy came to him as a young kid, the prophet says to him, you're going to be the next king. Wow. He looked around and he says, I don't see nothing kingly going on in my life at all. There ain't nothing about what I do, tending sheep out in the middle of a field, that seems like it's that it's of kingdom material. You ever been that? You ever feel God just speak to your heart and encourage you and plant a seed that He wants to do something great through your life, and we start discounting it? Who am I? Or how could that ever happen? It doesn't make any sense. Sometimes those are the best situations when they don't make sense. It just might be the sign for sure it's a God thing, because He's asking you, He's asking me to trust Him to make a way. Because after all, He is the way maker. And I don't know if you know it or not, but He is also the promise keeper. And He's also the miracle worker. And He's also the light in the darkness, in the midst of our darkest moments. You know, David's life really took off the day he walked up on that Goliath scene. He walked up on that scene. The nation of Israel, who was known as God's people, right, had been in a standoff for 40 days with the Philistines. And the main thing between their victory that day was just simply a giant named Goliath. This Goliath was taunting the armies of God. If anybody would come out and fight me and win, we'll be your servants. If not, if you lose, you'll be our servants. And everybody in the army of God, you would think, being God's people, they would immediately turn and focus on God as their source of their strength for victory. But yet they looked with these eyes, the natural eyes, and they looked at all the men. And they looked in the natural and they says, who can beat this giant? Who can beat him? And you know what they came up with? Zero. You ever been there before? When you thought all about how you can accomplish something, how you can do something, or the doctors have said there's no hope, everything in the natural says, nope, you can't do it. David walks up. David has his faith glasses on. He asks what's going on. He says, well, I don't see the problem. According to my faith glasses, who does this uncircumcised Philistine think he is? Coming against the armies of the living God. See, David had a history of God bailing him out. Just like probably you do and probably like I do. If we're honest, we can look back and say, man, God's faithful. He saw me through some stuff already. But now you're facing a Goliath. David looked at this man and he says, I'll take him on. And the miracle part of the story is that the nation of Israel was so desperate that they said they trusted their future to this kid. That's the power of faith. A young boy having faith inspired all of them and allowed them to trust him because of his faith. If you don't think our faith matters to change the world, that's a perfect example. To be people of faith against tremendous odds impacts others, and they end up seeing the tangible expression of God's presence living in us. Isn't that what glory is all about? Glory just means a tangible expression of His presence. And when we enact our faith, we are that living example of God's glory on earth. David walks out on the battlefield. Goliath's not happy at all. He says, what, am I a dog? You send a boy out here to fight me? He was upset. And he makes this declaration. He says, surely today, man, I'm going to feed your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. David replies, oh yeah? Will you come at me with your javelin, your sword, and your spear, and all that stuff? He says, but I come to you in the name of the Lord. And I'm going to feed your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And on top of that, I'm going to cut your head off. There's a problem with that statement, though. There is only one knife in this fight. David didn't have it. The only sword in the fight was on the side of Goliath. So imagine you're Goliath, and this guy's saying he's going to cut your head off. You're looking at David, he ain't got no armor on, he ain't got no sword. He just got a little slingshot in his hand, and he's threatening to cut your head off. And you say, like, where's he going to get that sword at? That boy thinks he's going to come take my sword. He's got another thing coming. That's exactly what David thought. I'm going to come take your sword off of you and cut your own head off. Well, we probably know how the story goes here, right? David winds up his slingshot. It's Goliath between the eyes. He goes down. Now imagine, David goes over to grab that sword. Just a young man. I don't know how big David's hands were at that time of his life, but I tend to say that they're probably pretty small. Grabbing a handle of a huge sword, trying to pull it out of the sheath. On top of that, trying to hold on to the head of Goliath, and maybe just laying there. Can you imagine this young man trying to take the head off of Goliath? It was probably physically taxing for him just to complete that last promise. He comes back with the head of Goliath. Guess what? Now David, everybody knows who David is. Remember that little boy in the field? Lord, how am I ever going to become king one day? I'm no king material. There's nothing but kingly about me. Now everybody in the nation, everybody knows David. Next thing you know, he's in the palace, serving in the army, being trained as a warrior, going out for battles. He became so good, probably in his late 20s, mid to late 20s. He becomes such a mighty warrior. One day he's coming back from battle, and the people begin to sing a song. They sing out that David kills his 10,000s and Saul kills his thousands. When King Saul heard that, it didn't sit well with him. Matter of fact, he became very jealous of David. Matter of fact, he disliked David so much that one day David's walking through the palace, and he throws a spear at him, a javelin at him. And David's like, "Hey, what are you trying to kill me for? I'm just here to serve you." You ever find yourself being persecuted and you're just trying to do the right thing? Man, I'm just trying to do my job. I'm just trying to treat that person nice. I'm just trying to help this person. That's your reward. David's confused. Lord, you've got these promises that you've made to me, and I think I'm on track, but then all of a sudden it's like there's other things that come at me, and things don't make sense sometimes. And I know you're the way maker. I know you're the promise keeper. I know you're the miracle worker. I know you're my light in my darkness, but I just don't understand why sometimes things happen to me. Well, another time David's walking through it, and it happens again. This time he goes to Jonathan. He says, "Jonathan, I just don't understand. Your dad tried to kill me again today. I mean, what have I done wrong? What have I done wrong to deserve this?" David felt himself in a little bit of a pit. How did I get in this one? Well, the king wants to kill me. Jonathan says, "Well, you know what? Maybe he's just having a bad day. You know, we have this little festival coming up where we all sit at the table. Tell you what, David, why don't you go out to the edge of the compound, you hide in the bushes for 2 or 3 days, and when I'm at the table, we'll see how the king Saul responds, my dad responds to you not being at the table. And I'll find out if he really wants to kill you or if he's just having a bad day. And then I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go to after I find out this information, I'll go and I'll shoot some arrows. And if I shoot him short and off to the side a little bit, it means come on home. But I shoot him far, or my servant has to run and go get him, then that means you're exiled from the kingdom. David said, okay. Now he's a seasoned warrior now. Now he's part of the king's court. Now he's just not some little peasant boy anymore. I mean, he's somebody. And all of a sudden he's hiding out in the bushes. Think about that for a minute. It's pretty humbling. He's hiding out in the bushes like a little criminal. He's hiding out there. I wonder what his conversations with God were about. God, how did I end up in the bushes? How did I end up being out here waiting for arrows to be shot to find out my future? Have you ever waited on a phone call before? Or waited for a report? Or the answer to an interview? Or the doctor's report? Just waiting to find out about your future? David was just waiting. Finally, Jonathan comes. Puts that arrow in, pulls it back, lets it go. David's out in the field. Long. You see, I'm sure David thought many times, he's got to shoot him. I know it's going to be short. That's the only thing that makes sense is for it to be short for me to go back to the kingdom. I know he won't shoot it long because that means I'm exiled. It won't make no sense. Yet here he was watching it being shot long. You know what? Jonathan probably just a little excited. You probably just pulled back a little bit too hard on that, you know. The next one will be right. I'm sure he's going to shoot the next one right. Again, it wasn't the answer he wanted. By that third arrow, David knew his fate. David was no longer a part of the king's court. David was being exiled. Jonathan comes out and they say their goodbyes. David walks away, dejected, confused. How did I end up here? How did I end up in this condition, Lord? How did I end up in this pit? Why is this happening to me? He's trying to remember the promises of God, but his life circumstances are confusing him. David goes to a neighboring village. I think it's called Nod. And he knew of a priest that lived in that town. Ahimelech was his name. David goes up to the door, knocks on the door. Ahimelech opens it. David, is that you? Is that you, David? David says, yeah, it's me. I imagine it was probably late at night, a little bit on the dark side. Ahimelech's like, hey, where's all your entourage? Where's all the king's men? Usually travel with a lot of people. Where is everybody? David does what any fugitive will do. He lies. He says, oh, I'm on a special mission for the king. And my guys, they went ahead and stuff. David still wanted to associate with the king's court. He couldn't accept the fact that he was no longer a part of it. He's lying to a priest. I'm part of the king's court. Still. And then he says this. Okay, if I come in, I'm a little hungry. Yeah, I bet he was a little hungry. He'd been hanging out in the bushes for 3 days, waiting for the answer for the rest of his life. David comes inside. asks Ahimelech, "Hey, you got anything to eat?" Ahimelech says this, it's kind of late at night. I really don't have anything except some showbread that I was using in my ceremonies earlier. It's a priestly duty. And ironically, Jesus calls himself the bread of life. And all Ahimelech had was some showbread for David. David says, "Well, if you don't mind, I don't mind. I'll eat it." Ahimelech says, "Well, here you go. Go ahead and eat it." I can imagine them kind of sitting at a table, maybe with a candle a little there flickering. And David's Ahimelech, "Hey, you got any weapons in this place?" You see, David ran off in such a hurry, he forgot to take his weapons with him. Ahimelech says, "Yeah, I got one weapon. Right over there. Wrapped up in that linen ephod over there. It's the sword of Goliath." What? Could you imagine David's mind? Like, what did you just say? You got one weapon in your house, in this priest's house, and it's the sword of Goliath? Why would you have what? What? David replies to Ahimelech, "Well, that's a good one. That's a good weapon. You're going to have one weapon. That's a good one." Now imagine David. Imagine you being David. You go over and you open that up. Your hand is reaching for that handle, and no longer is it a little boy's hand. No longer are you just a young kid trying to figure out your life. Now you're seasoned. Now you're a warrior. And you see that sword, and your mind goes back to the last time you held that sword, the last time you were in that field, that time you're facing Goliath, and you're remembering the faithfulness of your God. You're remembering the one that saw you through a battle that everyone else was fearful of. And in the midst of your darkest pit, and you feel like your life is upside down, all of a sudden David remembers who he is, and he grabs a hold of that handle. And he lifts up that sword. And his spirit is lifted again as he remembers the God that gives him victories. You see, that provision of that sword was waiting for David before that javelin was ever thrown, before those arrows were ever shot. God already had the answer for David's life before he ever had the trial. That's the God we serve. That's the faith glasses. That my God, as Paul wrote in Philippians, shall supply all my needs according to his riches in glory. Listen, I love that. The riches in glory. Glory, the tangible presence of God in our life. How he shows up in the midst of our pits, in the midst of our trials. And he says, remember what I've done for you. Remember how much I love you. Remember the grace that I have for you. Remember the mercy. Remember the love. Remember the forgiveness. And he says, you're my tangible expression of my presence on earth. When you're having a victory or if you're going through a trial in your life, just remember who you are. And David began to remember who he was. You see, David, just shortly after that, ended up in a cave. And God supernaturally sent him all these people who were in debt and discontented in life and everything else. He sends them all these roughnecks, right? And God was saying to David, David, you learn how to lead these men, and you'll be ready to be a king. Some of those roughnecks, the outcasts of society, later were known as David's mighty men. My brothers and sisters, submit yourself to the plan of God for your life. Understand that every battle, every trial we go through is an opportunity for us to enact our faith and be a tangible expression of God's presence. Simply ask this question daily of yourself. When you walk into places, you walk into your work, you walk into a store, you walk into the gas station, simply ask this question. Holy Spirit, what's my responsibility? That's where I've been in my life for the last few years, where success